Hey guys, it's Sean from planningfire.com here again with part 4 of the Millionaire Next Door series. If you're interested in reading this along with me, I'll leave a link down in the description below so you can purchase it yourself. But welcome to part 4. We're going to cover my reading session going into the Millionaire Next Door and highlight some of the key concepts and components that I saw. So this reading session was largely related to this concept of economic outpatient care. They call it EOC. What it is largely is just someone receiving money from a parent or guardian that exceeds their income, and it makes it difficult to kind of balance their income with these gifts. So they use two folks, M&L, throughout their initial review of economic outpatient care, and they're receiving gifts from their parents. Largely these are cash gifts of $10,000 or less, normally closer to $10,000 per year, because that is your taxable or your untaxable gift amount to your children. And as a household, they make $60,000 per year. The wife is a stay-at-home mom, and the husband is a school administrator. One key element of this section is that they do not budget. It's difficult for them to budget, and they wrote in because they were wondering how much money could be in their parents' trust because they needed access to it. So just something to keep in mind as we go through the next slides. All right, so continuing on the concept of economic outpatient care. Most of these people who receive this sort of benefit come from self-wealthy parents, first-generation American millionaires. It should be noted again that in this book, the large sample of people interviewed, if not all of them, were American millionaires, people living in America who earn their money in America. So it could be skewed depending on where you go. But that said, one really fascinating thing was, in general, the more money and support parents give to their children, the less the children normally earn going forward. And there's a lot of reasons that could potentially be. Personally speaking, I wonder if that relates directly to drive. Being a first-generation millionaire, these parents had to start their own businesses, or perhaps go to college as a first-generation student and get a great, outstanding job outside of college, but it really comes down to drive and effort. So they also speak on behalf of it's much easier to spend other people's money. And this concept is absolutely true. Personally, I'm in sales, so I do a lot of work with customers and clients. And when I go out and I'm taking clients out, I'll take them to nice meals, I'll take them wherever they want to go. It's just part of the job, which is excellent, makes for great meals. But at the same time, if I were to go to the same restaurant, I would spend nowhere near that kind of money, because quite frankly, a $100 steak to me is just as good as a $30 steak in most cases, except it costs a lot more. So I tend to weigh the pros and cons, but because it's not my money, it's technically my company's money, it's a lot easier to spend. 45% of millionaire parents pay for their grandchildren to go to private school. This is a huge percentage. It basically means that out of every 2 American millionaires, one of them is essentially paying for their kids' kids to go to private school. And there's some details later on about why this may be, but it's an interesting statistic. 60% of American millionaires will assist in a home down payment for their children. 17% will continue to make payments for their children after the down payment's made. And 30% of economic outpatient care recipients will own a home over $300,000 while making less than $60,000 a year. And that's a huge income disparity. So basically, if you have a $300,000 home and you're making less than $60,000, assuming you don't receive these gifts, you can barely afford to pay the mortgage, which makes it very difficult to become self-dependent. So the next chapter titled, What's Wrong with This Picture? Millionaires are much more likely to have medical students and law students as children. Basically, they're able to provide a lifestyle that allows these kids to go to the most expensive private schools and the most expensive colleges and the most expensive grad schools. So it does really taint the picture, because a lot of these students will turn out to be very wealthy and very successful in their futures. And 80% of millionaires do agree that paying for things like education is a huge step forward, and while it's technically a gift, it's not necessarily conceding to financial constraints. So it really comes down to, while they're still paying for school, the students still have to put in the effort to really excel. So paying for things, as in objects, doesn't tend to be a valuable use of your time or money. One thing they discuss in this chapter is the idea of a wealth artifact. So parents, or the self-made millionaires, went on a trip, found a beautiful Persian rug, they gifted it to their child, and their child took it home. Now this person's not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. He looks around his house realizing he has a bunch of IKEA furniture, hand-me-downs, and things similar, and this very expensive rug looks out of place. So whether or not this is a great decision, I'm going to have to go ahead and say it's not, but he goes out and purchases new expensive hardwood furniture and custom designed bookshelves to match this Persian rug. It's a gift that ended up costing him quite a bit of money. Honestly, the best solution, put it in a closet or in storage, but quite frankly, that's the option they went with. And these wealth artifacts generate that sort of behavior. Also, these gifts can be habit forming. So for example, if your parent gives you $15,000, tells you to go on vacation or buy a new car or what have you, all of a sudden now you're relying on these gifts coming in every year. And if you don't receive them, you now have outstanding loans or potentially some credit to pay back that you can't. So these gifts absolutely make a dependence relationship between the money and your parents. Also, giving these gifts for the vast majority of folks increases consumption habits. There are two professions where those consumption habits did not increase with the giving of gift, and that was teachers and professors. They just found more valuable ways like investing to take that cash and turn it into future returns. But in most of the sample they interviewed, it directly correlated to an increase in consumption. Also, the EOCs in this chapter tend to not distinguish between their own wealth and their parents' wealth. And this is directly a correlative to the fact that they are receiving these gifts that they've developed habits around getting. So they assume that they're going to receive these gifts in perpetuity because it balances directly into their own feeling of net worth. So it's hard for them to distinguish between their parents' wealth and their own. They tend to also leverage more credit because they know they're going to be getting more money in the future. So they put it on credit because they don't necessarily look at the big picture. They also tend to invest less and substantially less. Your average recipient of economic outpatient care invests 65% less than the children who don't receive any form of gifting. They also tend to donate more to charities, the gap being 6% of the total net worth versus 3%. So these people are also giving away more of their own money, which is super interesting because it's all correlated to less individual net worth. They did have one very interesting case study. It's essentially two brothers who are similar in age to the same millionaire parents. These brothers are Henry and Josh. I'm not sure if those are actual names or ones they just used for the case study, but Henry and Josh, very similar backgrounds, same parents, around the same age. One is a teacher and one is an attorney. On paper, you'd assume the attorney has a much higher net worth, but in reality, Henry, the teacher, has a much higher net worth. He only has a $71,000 salary, but his net worth is $834,000 at the time of writing, whereas his brother, the attorney's salary, is $123,000. Almost double that of the teacher's salary, but his net worth is only around $553,000. And really what this breaks down to is that Henry lives a frugal lifestyle. Everything he does is cheap, it's easy to do, his family prefers camping to vacations, or expensive overseas vacations, and Josh, on the other hand, is not frugal. He has this problem where he likes the nicer things in life, if you will. And it comes down to optics. Henry, being an attorney, can definitely justify driving a nicer car. Every day he pulls in the driveway, he sees nice cars. All of his peers are driving nice, expensive luxury vehicles. And there is something to be said about optics. If someone is going to an attorney and that attorney doesn't have a nice vehicle, or perhaps they have to do a ride along to get to court, and they see that this attorney has a old, used, beat up vehicle, they may think, well, why does this attorney have such a poor living condition? Is my attorney a bad attorney? Is there actually a correlation there? Absolutely not. But it does come down to optics. So being a teacher has none of those same pressures or social pressure to buy nice things. It really does come down to being able and being allowed to be frugal. The next chapter, and probably one of the more important lessons here, is teaching your children to fish. Basically, from an early age, start teaching your children about frugality. Teach them about the value of a dollar. It's a very difficult thing to do in reality, but it pays dividends down the road. So one example I'm personally thinking about is the down payment on the mortgage from earlier in the chapter. So giving your children a huge down payment or a huge portion of their down payment is an excellent gift. It can really kick them off on the right foot. But in reality, what it may be doing is having them buy a house that's actually out of their range. So what you should do is sit your children down, go over their finances, identify what an appropriate size mortgage would be payment-wise, and then from there, if you want to offer assistance towards closing, once the house is picked, and they've made their decisions, fantastic. You're going to kickstart them and really give them a generous gift. But if your down payment's the only reason they can afford the house they're buying in the neighborhood they're buying for, that could absolutely set them up for this dependent relationship. Make sure you're considering all factors prior to getting into this arrangement. 80% of all millionaires agree that spending on education is a proper step up and it doesn't lead to a dependency. That's something to keep in mind. Because of course, if your children don't come out of school with huge amounts of crippling student loan debt, which we'll have to talk about in a future video, but instead come out debt-free in a great career with great returns, they're much more likely to be successful and financially independent. Also, from an early age, start to endorse and support independent behaviors when it comes to finances. So for example, perhaps you may want to assist them in finding their first job. But what you don't want to do is get them their first job that's so far out of reach that perhaps it's not an appropriate lesson. So if you help them get a job, say, sweeping a warehouse, that's great. If you help them become a junior financial executive at a firm that's way out of their reach, perhaps that's not the right lesson. But what you want to do is allow them to be independent, providing as little assistance as you can, and endorsing behaviors that promote independence. I absolutely agree with this concept. There is a correlation between more success and less financial support. And that's something you really want to think about. The less financial support a parent is giving to a child as far as economic outpatient care is concerned, the more successful they tend to be. I think that probably ties into a hunger and a drive that we'll talk about later. Also, don't play into a weakness, but strengthen it. And the example they use here is the popular example of, hey, my child is failing math. So you have two options. You can either try to do something about it or remove them from the problem. And a lot of parents go with the second route, calling the teachers, changing the schools, changing the program. But in reality, it really comes down to having to learn it and enhance the skill set. Because if you just pull them out of difficult situations, they really never learn to be independent. They also have an excellent example about risk and drive. Really, one relates directly to the other. A daughter of self-made millionaires wanted to start their own business. So their parents figured if she could only focus on the business and not have to worry about the financials around it, she'd be much more successful. But in reality, they supported all of her decisions financially, and they co-signed loans and paid out of pocket. And all of a sudden that drive and that risk, because you know you have X amount of dollars outstanding in loan debt, was no longer there, making for a much more lackadaisical attitude around the business. Most small business owners, if they made the same financial decisions this person made in the first year, would be out of business and it would be closed up. But in reality, this business subsists entirely on their parents' generous financial gifts. So make sure if you're offering support, lend them mentorship, perhaps connect them with the right people, but don't provide direct financial assistance because they still need that hunger and they still need that drive. And the final chapter of my reading was the affirmative action family style. Basically, the author discusses two separate types of housewives. A type A housewife. This kind of person tends to marry into high-income partners and is well-versed in tax law and finance. They do that research, they know about estate taxes, they know how to mitigate financial tax burdens, and they're an active participant in the family's financial planning. The parents then will see this person as a peer. When it comes to end-of-life planning, they know that they can trust their children to be someone who's there and knowledgeable on those topics. The type A housewife is really a partner financially, even if there's no direct income. Then they have the concept of a type B partner. They tend to marry into lower income families. They tend to be highly dependent on their parents and their gifts, most of which living near their parents. They will frequently go shopping or clothes shopping with their parents to receive the free things that the parents are willing to give them. But because of this, the parents will always see them as children, as dependents. And without their direct financial support, they're afraid or worried of their child failing or, even worse, perhaps going bankrupt. But also these type of people tend to have partners who work, say, for the family business. And they're afraid what will happen if they no longer are married. So they're always going to be dependents. There's much more detail in the book. Those are the key elements that I took away. Also, they say that women are much more likely to receive inheritance than their male counterparts. So the daughters in the families tend to get much more in terms of inheritance than the brothers. Another just interesting statistic that I wanted to get down. So that's the end of this session. Again, if you want to follow along, links in the description box. But quite honestly, this was a fairly interesting chapter. It kind of came down to a lot of interesting details that seem really obvious, but having them written in front of you always opens up your eyes. Author, once again, well written, well documented. It is a touch repetitive. A lot of the statistics that they write on, I wonder where they're extrapolating the data from, but it is well researched. There's a lot of appendices and graphs and charts, so highly recommend it. Thanks again for your time. Have a great week.